Yes, this morning I'm delighted to say Andy McDonald, trade unionist, who's been very vain this morning, and Akhila Jayaram, area chair, Conservative Women's Organisation. Good morning to the two of you.
Good morning, good morning.
You were preening yourself.
You check your eyebrows once and you're preening. What? No, I'm just making sure I'm fit for the viewers of Talk.
I'm not used to seeing men use their iPhone as a mirror.
What else would I use as a mirror? You know,
anyway, let's move on. Thank you very much indeed for coming in as well, Akhila. This is your first time with us, so thank you very much indeed. I mean, shall we just start with the question that I'm asking? We're seeing, obviously, these scenes in Israel, that more hostages being released, which has to be a good thing. The 4-day ceasefire in effect. As I keep saying, every 10 Israelis that are released, there'll be another day of ceasefire. At the same time, we're seeing all these pro-Palestinian marches taking place. Again, yesterday, we saw people inciting hatred. The police, I think, did a good job yesterday. They put out leaflets saying, if you do this, this is illegal, and we will clamp down, which they did. They arrested people.
One person.
All right, but I'm trying to be fair to the police. But maybe the behaviour was better. I don't know. I wasn't there. But we also have another march today, a march against anti-Semitism, and as many people are making out, we need to be united. What do we do from here? The country is in a total mess. It seems to me that the country is incredibly divided, and we need to bring the country together. What do we do?
So I think at the moment, like you said, there are people who support Palestine, there are people who support Israel, but what we need to think is about, humanity altogether. I think that could be a uniting factor. So it could be about, the immediate release of hostages. I think that's what we should be pushing for more and more together, and sort of bringing that more into the public eye. I think, and not sort of questioning whether it actually happened, which I've seen in social media as well. I think that's something that needs to be put forward. And also, the Palestinians who are facing the impact of all these bombings, people need to think about that. So I think if we think about humanity at its sort of fundamental level, it can bring people together.
Can I just ask you, for people in this country who are there chanting from the river to the sea, calling for the obliteration of Israel, wearing Hamas headbands, how on earth have we allowed this to happen in this country?
So I think it comes back to the sort of narrative that's being pushed out in social media. I think that's probably where it's coming from. So I've seen posts being shared on Instagram, TikTok without question. So I think this is something we need to really focus on, because again, young people are more susceptible to these messages than others. So I think that's where we need to sort of target.
Andy, it's about social media. I think that's a really good point, actually, because I do wonder how much of this young people understand, the indoctrination. Do they know what they're chanting? I've asked that question before. Do they actually understand what they're doing? But also, they're covering their faces. They've got bandanas on, which are Hamas-style headbands. They must know what they're doing.
I think some of them do, most don't. It's a march of, you've seen numbers like 200,000, 300,000, and it is a very small minority of them that are wearing these headbands, as I'm sure, even you can agree with that. It is a small minority that are wearing the headbands, that are with the terrorist sympathy, the terrorist sympathised flags, whatever. It's in a march of 300,000. If you get 200 people that are wrong, that's pretty good going. But I do think a lot of the chants, people get carried away on marches. I've been on plenty of marches, and chants just happen, and you get carried away. And I think if they actually sat and they reflected, they probably wouldn't agree with it.
And just in terms of the march today, a march against anti-Semitism, which many people feel is the right thing to do, Tommy Robinson, people like that, have said they are going to turn up and march in this march against anti-Semitism.
Hasn't he got a football fan to beat up or something?
Well, the organisers have told him to stay away. They don't want him anywhere near there. He says he supports the aims of the march through central London. The organisers say it will be the biggest protest against anti-Jewish hatred since the 1936 Cable Street protest, which is incredibly significant.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's run by the Campaign Against Anti-Semitism. A great organisation. I'm a friend of it. I donate to it. I think it's a fantastic organisation. But people like Tommy Robinson coming in, people can hold whatever views on him that they want. He was a member of the EDL. He's a convicted felon, and he's a fraudster. he's washed up racial hatred for the last 15 years. He can't come to this.
I agree.
He's a racist.
I absolutely agree. Of course I do. But also, don't forget, it suits the narrative to actually focus on him and not what the march is trying to achieve.
In fairness, he did ask me about.
Yeah, no, I know. But that's a general point. That actually, we need the press to ignore people like this and focus on the masses of the people that were there. I will be one of them, who are there for peace and for kindness, not for what the likes of Tommy Robinson.
But isn't there a real worry here? I was looking back at the Battle of Cable Street. It's really near me in London, actually. This was a huge march in the 1930s, a period of enormous political instability. We saw the uprising that happened here. Are you worried that actually we're on the brink of something really very unpleasant in this country?
So I think we need to be really careful as to where this is heading, because the divisions that have been exposed can, as you said, lead to something else. We don't want sectarian violence being imported into this country. 100%. I think that's something I'm really concerned about, because I was born in India, where we used to see this happening every now and then, and it was quite difficult for the government to sort of control it. I don't want that to sort of replicate on the streets of Britain.
Let's move on and talk about Ukraine. I'm just wondering, Russia, this is in the wake of Russia launching its biggest drone strike on Kyiv since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine began last year. This is according to the city's mayor. For more than 6 hours, there were 75 Iranian-made Shahed drones fired at the capital. Russia is losing its supply of military weapons. It's now using drones because they're much cheaper. But even if you intercept those missiles, the debris can be lethal. And I'm just wondering, have we forgotten about Ukraine? Because all focus and attention is on Israel and Gaza. Ukraine has completely gone off the radar.
I think in the media, yes. I think very much so. You know, the media do flit and, you know, they go to whatever is popular. But I don't think the diplomatic corps of this country, you know, you're looking at the Foreign Office, looking at the Ministry of Defence, I don't think they've forgotten about it. You know, I think those relations are still ongoing and still being developed. But I think from a media perspective, yes.
But what is interesting, and there's another story that we are not concentrating on, which is that Germany and the US are pressurising Ukraine to negotiate with Russia. I mean, I think it's fairly well known that it has stalled. I remember last week talking about the foothold, but the Ukrainians' top general warning there is no quick breakthrough. There's a stalemate. They haven't taken the ground that they wanted to take. And now it looks increasingly like the West saying to Zelensky, you're going to have to push for some sort of deal.
Well, and I think that was then further cemented this morning when there's another story that the Americans are pushing Zelensky to have a democratic election because they're saying that they need to have that. But Zelensky is arguing that when you've got 1 million troops on the front line, you've got 1.5 million people who no longer are in Ukraine because they're refugees. How do you have a democratic election? But I don't know what you feel, that is actually just more pressure to settle.
It definitely seems like more pressure, but I think the UK has been steadfast in its support.
I would agree.
So I think that we can sort of be the mediator, I think, in this sense, to sort of have a dialogue between the US and Germany and Ukraine. So I think that's what can be done at this point.
And yet there is a real problem in Germany. I think there are domestic problems in the German government. They are very concerned about the amount of money they're spending. They can't see any breakthrough in Ukraine. I think they are pushing. I think the US is pushing. I think there is war weariness, isn't there?
And money weariness.
Yeah, indeed.
Yeah, I agree.
And so what do we do, though? Do we stay steadfast? Because that was the point that was made about David Cameron saying we will stick with Ukraine through thick and thin. Do you believe him?
Well, Lord Cameron of Chipping Norton. I'm not sure I believe a word that comes out of his mouth, but no, I don't think. I think, you know, you should obviously sue for peace when possible, because, you know, you look, as we were talking about in the Palestinian and Israeli conflict, there are civilians that are genuinely being hurt.
Exactly.
They're the ones being hit by this lethal debris. You know, for their sake, we should be suing for peace whenever possible. It shouldn't be, oh, well, we've got a bit of an advantage, so we won't give up. I think we should be suing for peace.
And so, but what's the feeling in this country? I mean, these are two wars that are going on, not on British shores, that we are implicitly involved in. When you look at the numbers here, 240,000 dead. That's a huge number over in Ukraine, this battle between Ukraine and Russia. And yet at the same time, do you think there's an appetite from the British public to continue to be involved?
I think so, yeah. I think a lot of the British public are quite empathetic, because if it was happening to us, we'd want support from our neighbours. So I think I think there is still a kind of feeling of solidarity with the people of Ukraine and those in Gaza.
It is
but I think, you know, looking at the
this.
Falklands, this is another thing that might kick off with Argentina.
All Argentinian presidents want the Falklands back.
Well, it's
nobody announced it.
No, but it's a really good ruse for them, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's in terms of their domestic policy,
It really
looking
is.
tough, saying they're going to take back the Malvinas. That will not happen.
Yeah.
I'm excited to see David Bill on the front lines of the Falklands, you know, defending from the Argentinians.
I would absolutely defend the Falkland Islands. Thank you.
But it is interesting, isn't it, that we didn't have marches on our streets every weekend when the Russian civilians or the Ukrainian civilians were killed in this warfare.
I think there was initially, yeah, there was a lot. I remember going to so many vigils in Nottingham at the time. There was one every week at the Brian Clough statue. I remember there were thousands out. Okay. And I imagine it was the same in London.
Akhila, let me just bring you in here. There is definitely, in my view, a fracturing in the European Union over how much support we give to Ukraine. I think, as Rennie says, it is also about money. The Slovak Premier, Robert Fico, says the Ukraine war risks lasting until 2030 if peace talks are not started. They're talking about the conflict being frozen. They say it will carry on till 2030. This is an interesting line. It's better to lead talks for 10 years in peace with suspended combat operations than go to negotiations after 10 years without any result. They're weakening. They're saying, actually, we need a ceasefire, we need a deal.
So I think with regard to Ukraine and Russia, there's sort of other geopolitical considerations with regard to them joining the NATO and so on. So I think that's something the European Union should take into consideration, because if it's going to be a ceasefire, how's that going to, follow through with regard to their membership of NATO, for example? Is that going to be suspended as well, or is that going to be pursued? There are things like that we need to think about. I think the European Union should be sort of united in that front, at least, rather than just...
But also, what message does it say? That if Ukraine hasn't recaptured the territory that is truly Ukrainian, what does it say? That we give in, that in Europe we don't actually follow through? I think that's a very difficult message.
Indeed, I think with Russia, it is going to be taken as a sign of weakness and might sort of promote further aggression in the future. So I think it's a very, fine line of balance that needs to be...
And does it also then cement Putin within his country as the autocrat that he is, and give him another 10 years?
Wouldn't he? He would be seen to be victorious. That's a terrible message to be sending, Andy.
I think whether or not he wins, the Russian propaganda machine in the Kremlin will make it look like he wins, inevitably, unless there is a physical intervention by Western forces. It will always look like Putin wins, because that's the propaganda. So I think in that regard, I think it doesn't really matter.
So can I bring everything back now to the United Kingdom? Let's talk about the migration crisis, because Rishi Sunak, as you know, he said, oh right, the Rwanda deal, that's not going very well, is it? It was ruled by the Supreme Court, so they're going to turn the agreement into a treaty. We're going to have emergency extraordinary legislation, which, by the way, I still haven't seen. It hasn't appeared. Apparently the cabinet is now very split about what should happen. We also now have the Home Secretary James Cleverly and the Attorney General Victoria Prentice understood to oppose what Robert Jenrick has said, and we talked about what Robert Jenrick wants to do. He says we should actually leave the Human Rights Act to the European Convention on Human Rights. There is clearly a massive split going on within cabinet. At the same time, Rishi Sunak has said, he's come out, there's an article in the Mail saying a vote for Nigel Farage's lot would put Starmer in number 10, warns Rishi Sunak. How desperate is Rishi Sunak at this point?
Well, I think, that's been the line for years and years and years. You go back to the Cameroon years, vote for UKIP, you get Miliband, was it? It's been the line for a long time, in fairness to Sunak. But, they don't take this migration crisis seriously. Over the last 13 years, you've had 8 Home Secretaries. That's a joke. They clearly don't take it seriously. Sunak hasn't taken it seriously since the start when he reappointed Suella Braverman after breaking the ministerial code. He just doesn't take it seriously. He's not a serious bloke.
Let's ask Akhila, just in terms of the Conservative Party, I see enormous fracturing going on within the Conservative Party. They thought they would have that bounce. They did. It went from 19% up to 22, 23, 24% for the Conservative Party. Then we found out 745,000 people had come here legally. You've then got Boris Johnson wading in saying, oh, whoops, we've set the threshold too low. It was 27,000. It should be now 40,000. Rishi Sunak, desperate. He's deeply worried about Nigel Farage and his bottom in the jungle, isn't he? What's the mood like in the Tory party?
So I think people definitely do want migration to be reduced, but I think the government should square off on why the migration numbers are so high. So I think up to 39% are international students, and the government wanted to increase that to 600,000. So I think being honest with the public as to why it has increased to such numbers. But I think
they were shocked themselves.
Well, I think they should be aware of the fact that they have been sort of loosening policies to attract more students here to the UK, and these numbers are a direct result of that.
How big a problem is Nigel Farage for Rishi Sunak?
Well, I think it's a bit of a tricky one, because I don't think it's going to sway the Conservative vote as much, but in the two by-elections we've seen that votes to reform...
Say that again. So you don't think, that Nigel or Reform UK will sway people from the Conservatives?
Not completely, but they can be a threat to the vote share. So we've seen in Tamworth and Mid Beds.
Indeed.
We saw that...
Two Labour seats.
Right, but the point you're making is that Reform UK split the Tory vote.
That's not true.
Well, I don't think so. Not at the moment,
okay.
Unless they take action.
How big a problem is Nigel Farage for Rishi Sunak?
I don't think he is. Nigel Farage, he tried to be an MP 5 times, lost 5 times.
Only because of the first past the post.
It's the first past, but also
the system that we still live in, and will be the next election.
Yes,
that
but
we go
that's
into.
not what we're saying.
That's not because of Nigel Farage.
But we're not actually saying it's about taking seats. It's taking vote share, depriving Conservatives of a majority. That's the point. Rishi Sunak is clearly very worried about what Reform UK is doing. Now, also, and I know this, and I would know this, wouldn't I, that the Reform Party stood down because they believe the Conservative Party. This will not happen again. Richard Tice has made this entirely clear. They will, and Nigel has made this clear, they will destroy the Conservative Party.
Yeah, I'm sure Richard Tice thinks that. But, I look at their electoral history.
You should be thrilled, shouldn't you, as a Labour drum banger?
Reform UK, as a Labour drum banger, I think very little about Reform UK. They're not a threat. Their candidates can't even tell the difference between them and the Conservatives. There was that famous interview done by Joe Politics. It was a candidate somewhere in Birmingham. When asked, what are your policies, what differs to the Conservatives, he couldn't answer, he stuttered. That's all he did.
Who was that interview?
It was with Joe Politics. It was with one of the Reform UK's prospective parliamentary candidates for somewhere in Birmingham.
Well, to be fair, Keir Starmer doesn't know the difference between a man and a woman, so I don't think that's entirely
fantastic.
fair.
Yes, that's exactly the same thing. Not knowing your own policies and a complicated issue on socio-gender issues. It's very much not the same.
Socio-gender issues, right? Okay, that's interesting Mandarin speak. Just Akhila, how big a problem do you think it is for the Conservative Party? I mean, as you know, the Conservative Party is in dire straits, 19%. Reform UK climbing in the polls. There's a big editorial in the paper saying Reform UK on 11% and climbing. It is a problem for the Conservative Party.
Well, I think it's about delivering on the pledges that Rishi Sunak has put forward. So I think if he really takes control of inflation, which he has to a certain extent, and also addressing the migration numbers, I think people would sort of give the Conservatives a decent chance.
Has he addressed inflation?
Well, it's definitely going down.
It's going down, but
it's still an increase on what it should be, and the effects of the inflation are still there. They're still tangible. Food prices are still up.
Indeed.
Like the cost of living crisis is still there.
I don't think anywhere in history when inflation goes down do the prices ever go back to what they were. Look, I'm not arguing for Rishi Sunak because I'm not convinced that he had anything to do with inflation. But
to say he's improved inflation, it's not. It's still 6%.
Well, I don't think it was
higher than it should be.
I don't think it was anything to do with him, to be honest, because it was cost push inflation, not it was cost push inflation, not demand pull inflation. So it was nothing to do with him. It was to do with the global.
But he'll take credit for reducing it.
Well, absolutely.
So I think if he's going to take credit for...
Let's just pause for the moment, Andy and Akhila. Just stay exactly where you are. We'll continue this after the break. This is TalkTV. Let's move to the front page of the Sunday Times, because this, again, to me, looks desperate. We've now got this headline. I was offered a lot of money to defect to Reform, says the Tory Deputy Chairman. This is Lee Anderson. He was secretly recorded claiming he was offered a lot of money to defect to Reform UK. He made the comments at a Lagers with Lee meeting at Cambridge Rugby Club last month, saying, "We're not taping this. are we? He said there's a political party beginning with R that's offered me a lot of cash to join them. How desperate are the Conservative Party if he's putting stuff out like this, which, by the way, Richard Tice says is fundamentally untrue? Isn't there also a major issue here with Nigel Farage being in the jungle? René and I were talking about this. I think people are possibly warming to him. They're seeing a different side of him. I think he's been literally a different side, which really you don't want to see. But what Nigel is very good at is gauging the mood of the public. He obviously has now a huge audience watching him, including people who are floating voters, and I think this election is very much up for grabs still.
So I think it's a matter for Lee Anderson to address, and I think the Conservative Party should probably distance itself from the comments. That's my personal view on this, because I mean he's deputy chairman of the party and he has responsibility, you know, in terms of that. I don't think he should be going on making these flippant comments of being sort of us recruited by Reform, which may or may not be true at this point. So I think he needs to really think about what he speaks.
What does that do for you on the ground as someone who is supportive of the Conservative Party? Do comments like this help you or hinder you?
So I think it depends on the constituency. Some places it could hinder us, but some places it just doesn't matter because people just block that sort of view out.
It has really got people going, this, about Reform, and you, Andy, in particular, and the comments that you're making. So Steve says, ignore Reform at your peril, Andy MacDonald. I've never met a trade unionist yet that wasn't aligned to Labour. Reform will take the North East. And then Robert says, never mind Nigel Farage's backside. Andy's supercilious comments about Reform will come back and bite his Labour backside.
Right. Okay.
You've got people going, Andy, because you've been quite dismissive of a party that's doing very well.
And remember,
I just couldn't name 5 of their policies. I think they've probably only got about 5 policies. Their shadow.
Well, I can tell you that
their shadow front bench doesn't actually align with government departments for one. That's one issue.
What's that got?
Like you've got a shadow spokesman for the culture or the union. Those aren't government departments.
Well, but they should be because we need to preserve the union. The point is,
they're not.
The point is,
technically, the Prime Minister is the Minister for the union.
Well, he's not doing a very good job, is he? Because he's sold Northern Ireland down the Swanee. But as someone, obviously, and I am affiliated, but René is right here. You ignore every single vote at your peril. I've done politics long enough to know that every single vote counts. And this is the point that other people are saying. John says here, Reform UK will have a big influence on the next election. The problem for the Conservative Party is Reform UK stood aside once before. They were completely stuffed by the Conservative Party. There is no way any deal will ever take place. And I know that we have many disaffected Conservatives who frankly believe the Conservative Party isn't conservative, with the highest tax burden in 70 years, saying, I don't like them, I don't like the Labour Party, I don't like the Lib Dems, and then that's why they're going to Reform UK. Something has to... If the Conservative Party wants to win this election, which is possible... unlikely, but possible, they're going to have to do something radical. What would you do to win the election?
So I think I would look at tax cutting. I think that's probably one of the easiest ways to sort of get back our voters. But again, it's a difficult economic situation.
Which taxes would you cut?
I think I would cut income taxes. I'm in favour of working people. I think we need to show people that it pays to work.
So with Liz Truss is looking increasingly like she was right, because that's what Hunt is now following. He's following Liz Truss.
Well, I think we need to go for growth at this point of time. We've been in stagnation economy for quite some time, so I think we need to really look at that. I think there have also been talks about inheritance tax, but I think that's a lower priority compared to income taxes, in my opinion.
Yeah, that's really interesting. What should Labour do to win?
What should Labour do to win? Keep letting the Conservatives hang themselves, I think, just... stepping back and going, well, look at those guys.
Isn't that such a negative manifesto?
Oh, I think it's fair. I think looking at, from a manifesto perspective, we've got a great New Deal for working people. So, ensuring that minimum wages equal across all age ranges. I think that is a big thing, which is needed.
What's the great vision that Labour has for Britain?
I think just rebuilding it after 13 years of complete chaos. Bringing some stability back.
Highest tax burden we've had for 70 years.
Yeah, under a conservative government.
Agreed.
So what's the flagship policy? You went on about reforms policies. What's the great policy that everyone in this country is going to get behind?
I think the great policy is the GB Energy. I would say. I think it will bring 200,000 jobs. It will start investing in green energy, and it is a phased green energy investment over 15 years. So we won't have any of the stop-start stuff that you're
Aren't they already
about.
watering that down?
No.
Yes, they are. 28 billion. The Labour Party is now starting to reverse on it. They know it's not possible.
That was a reported source. That wasn't an official statement. That was a reported source.
Well, let's see.
When that comes out,
Andy, I look forward to this great Labour vision, which is going to be put before me before the next general election. Just in terms, finally, if I can come to you, Akhila, the Conservative Party. What's the vision? I don't see a vision from the Conservative Party. Rishi Sunak has said, "Oh look, immigration's a bit high." That's the understatement of the year. Taxes are a bit high, understatement of the year. What's the great vision for this country?
So I think it talks about long-term priorities. I think that's probably going to be the...
And what are they?
So looking at, bringing down the cost of living. So I think that's one of them. And also sort of looking at immigration as well. I think when we look at immigration, we also need to look at how can we make the lives of people in the UK better, instead of always, thinking about getting our healthcare workers from abroad. How can we, better build the infrastructure here? But I think that takes a while to sort of develop. It's not a short-term thing. So I think the Conservative manifesto would be possibly having a long-term horizon.
Perfect. Thank you very much indeed to both of you, Andrew McDonald, trade unionist, and Akhila Jayaram, area chair of the Conservative Women's Organisation. And that